The Marvel Cinematic Universe's approach to time travel does not make a lot of sense, but hopefully Loki is going to fix it. So I'm a massive time travel nerd, and I was a little bit let down by Endgame. I came out of it not really understanding what Marvel's approach to time travel was. So in this video I've kind of delved into it and tried to work it out. And I'm also going to be looking into how Loki is going to build on the idea of time travel in the MCU and kind of fix some of the confusion that there is still out there about how time travel works in it. Okay, so to understand Marvel's problem with time travel, it's worth first looking at the 3 different types of time travel in fiction. So I am a bit of a time travel nerd, and I do like a lot of different time travel shows and films. And the way I see it, there's 3 main types. You've got rewritable, fixed, and branching. Okay, so the idea behind a rewritable timeline is that if you go back in time and you change something, like you stop your parents from getting married and having children, then the timeline rewrites itself. So, Back to the Future. So when Marty goes back in time, he kind of almost replaces his dad, gets a bit weird for a few minutes, and he almost prevents his own birth. And he looks at his photograph and he can see himself getting erased from time. So the timeline is rewriting itself to the new events. Now a fixed timeline, this is where everything that happens is predetermined. So even if you get a time machine and you go back in time and you try and change something, you can't. So an example of this is Prisoner of Azkaban. In Prisoner of Azkaban, even though Harry and Hermione go back in time, all they do is enable the events that have already happened to happen. So at one point, one of them gets hit by a stone in the back of the head. When they go back in time, they end up being the person who threw the stone. So they haven't changed anything, it's played out in a predetermined path. And then you have a branching timeline. Now this is quite similar to the rewritable timeline. However, when you go back and make a change, you create 2 timelines instead of 1. So you create a new timeline where that event has changed, but also there was still the timeline that you came from, so that still exists. So instead of rewriting the timeline, you've created a split and there's now 2. So the main difference is the rewritable timeline, there was only 1 timeline. In the branching timelines, you can have more than 1. So the best example of this is the remedial chaos theory episode of Community. And if you've seen that, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Basically, like, one decision can lead to loads of parallel timelines being created for all those different possibilities of what that decision's outcome is. That doesn't make any sense. It does kind of. If you've watched that episode of Community, you'll understand it. And if you don't understand it, go watch that episode. So those are the 3 main types, and we'll get into which one the Marvel Cinematic Universe seems to follow. But how does real time travel work in real life? So you can travel into the future. Everyone already is travelling into the future 1 second at a time. But you can also speed up the rate at which you travel into the future. And that's through time dilation. And I'm not a physicist, I don't really understand it. But if you watch Interstellar, that's what's happening in Interstellar. People have commented on my voice. I've got a bad throat. I'm trying to take some medication for it. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. It's kind of how I speak anyway, but it's also made worse by my bad throat. So leave off it. I've drank water, I've tried to fix it. I've got a medical problem. Yes, so time dilation means that you can travel into the future faster. But in order to do that, you probably need to be near a black hole or use a wormhole. Now, a wormhole is another way that kind of real life physicists have proposed that you could travel backwards in time. It's probably the only way you could do it. So the idea of a wormhole is it's where 2 bits of space-time are folded into each other. So if this post-it note is the flow of time, normally you can only travel in one direction forward, but a wormhole is where they're folded onto each other like that, and there's a hole that's gone through it. So you can then travel through there to a different point of space-time, and in theory that could be the past. Now, the reason I'm explaining that is partly because it's cool, it's real life science, but also that's basically the theory of the quantum realm in Endgame. So the quantum realm is like a little separate universe that goes alongside our universe. And Scott Lang realises that when he entered the quantum realm, he exited at a different point of time from where he entered. So time works differently in it. So essentially, Scott went through the paper. And that's when he realises, well, if I manage to go through the paper this way, forward into the future, maybe you can go backwards. So actually, there is some real life science in Endgame. And the time travel, there is some actual real life theory in there, which the Russo brothers have been at pains to say is in there.
And we were working very hard to find a new approach to time travel, one that was grounded in this idea of quantum physics, which is of course, a scientific concept that comes out of the Antman movies.
And so in Endgame, they use the quantum realm to travel back into the past to try and retrieve the Infinity Stones, and then bring them back, snap everyone back, and then take the stones back at the end. But the other way that you can time travel in the MCU is to use the time stone, and we'll get onto that later. So which version of time travel is Endgame using? Well, we can rule out fixed, because in fixed, everything played out one way, and you can't change it. And in Endgame, we see them kill 2014 Thanos, so we know it can't be a fixed timeline. So it has to be branching or rewritable. Now, rewritable is the Back to the Future theory, and the Russo brothers and the film itself goes at great lengths to say this is not Back to the Future. And literally we hear Bruce Banner say you can't change the past. So it's branching, which means multiple timelines are going to be created. You're not changing your own past, you're creating a new past. If that makes sense. I do sort of despise the fact that they go at great lengths to just badmouth Back to the Future.
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit.
How dare they? Back to the Future, it's a gem. It's one of the only films about time travel where people, like a general audience, can actually follow what's happening. And I think that's part of the problem with Endgame's time travel, is that they try and make out that all these other time travel films, they're stupid. They've got it wrong. We've got it right. Our version of time travel is brilliant. And the problem with Endgame is that the writers and the directors have different ideas of what's happening with the time travel. So I'm going to go with what the writers have said and what's literally said in the film. And that's mainly coming from the Ancient One. And she tells Bruce,
"The Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time. Remove one of the stones, and that flow splits."
They then say at the end of the film that they need to clip all the branches, the branched timelines, by returning the stones.
You have to return the stones to the exact moment you got them. You're going to open up a bunch of nasty alternative realities.
Don't worry, Bruce. Clip all the branches.
So presumably, taking a stone out creates a new timeline, returning the stone closes off the timeline, it ends it. And actually the writers explained that every time a stone is taken out in Endgame, it actually creates a new reality. So there was like a little mini multiverse created during Endgame, which was then closed off at the end when Cap returns the stones. And actually this is the reason why I mentioned the time stone, is actually this is quite similar to what Doctor Strange does with Dormammu. Doctor Strange creates a time loop where he goes to Dormammu multiple times, loads of millions of times. So whilst he's with Dormammu, you could see it as there being multiple timelines going on, but then they all merge back into the one Doctor Strange at the end. So in a way, I feel like they've almost created a new loop kind of idea, where you do have branching realities, branching timelines, but they only loop around back into the merged one at the end. I guess a bit like a maze, you know, but the start of the maze and the end of the maze are the same for everyone, but you could take multiple paths to get between those 2 points. And I think that's kind of what's going on with time travel in Endgame. So this is where it gets confusing when we start talking about Steve Rogers and old Cap. So if we go by what the writers have said, when Steve Rogers returns all the stones, he then closes off all the timelines and they merge into one MCU timeline. He then lives out from the 1940s to the 2020s in the MCU timeline, the normal MCU timeline. So for those 70 years or whatever it was, there are 2 Steve Rogers. However, the Russo brothers made it really confusing when they said that they thought that old Steve, old Cap, has lived out his life with Peggy in an alternate reality and then transferred back into the normal MCU for giving Falcon the shield. So if that's true, either returning the stones doesn't actually close the timelines, it just leaves them open, because they would have to have one remaining for Steve to live in, or after closing all the timelines, the very act that Steve stays in the past with Peggy, does that create a new timeline? And if that's true, it means that you can create a new timeline without taking out an Infinity Stone, because at that point, Cap hadn't taken out an Infinity Stone, he'd just returned all of them. So how's he created a new timeline? And even the writers don't agree with the Russo brothers. But the Ancient One specifically states that when you take an Infinity Stone out of a timeline, it creates a new timeline. So Steve going back and just being there would not create a new timeline. So I reject that Steve is in an alternate reality theory. So I think on this occasion, the Russo brothers are probably wrong. Because the writer's theory makes more sense for the logic of the film. If what the Russo brothers says is true, and Steve is living in an alternate reality, then the whole rules of the MCU's time travel will just go out the window. So those are my main 3 questions from watching Endgame. Is removing an Infinity Stone the only way to create and sustain a new timeline? Or can you just change a historical event? So for example, killing 2014 Thanos. Could that create a new timeline itself if you don't also steal an Infinity Stone? Does returning a stone close off the timeline? Or does it just protect that universe from threats? It's a little bit vague in what the Ancient One says. She says, if you don't return the stone, we will, millions of lives will be at risk. If they do return the stone, does that mean that they all kind of cease to exist, the people in that timeline? Or do they just merge back into the other one and all the memories and, the souls, whatever, just kind of merge into one? And to answer both of those questions would just be whether or not Steve Rogers, was he living in the MCU timeline or an alternate one for those 70 years? Because the answer to that kind of explains the other 2. So Loki, it's coming out soon. It's all about time travel. It's got the Time Variance Authority in it, and they are people who kind of govern time. They kind of fix time. So how could Loki fix this confusion about the timeline? From the trailers, it looks like they're establishing that there is one main sacred timeline that the TVA are trying to protect. So that would answer the question whether there are multiple timelines that are all existing at once and have branched off from the MCU timeline, or is there just one main MCU timeline? It looks like there is only one main sacred timeline. And as they literally said in the trailer, they've got all these branching paths that are going off that they need to fix, and they want Loki to help fix them. Going back to the questions from Endgame, those timelines that are branching off, are they branching off because someone has taken an Infinity Stone out, or are they branching off because someone has changed a historical event? That's what I think needs answering, and I think Loki's going to clear up that confusion. So for example, now if Loki goes to Pompeii and deliberately stops Pompeii from happening somehow, if he doesn't also steal an Infinity Stone, is that a permanent change or not? That's something that I think Loki needs to clear up. So I think Loki is going to answer a lot of these questions, because I think we're going to see people trying to change time within the show. And also we're going to see Loki trying to fix the broken branched timelines that the TVA have deemed broken. Now, how are they going to fix these branches? Are they going to return a stone to close off the timeline? Or is there another way you can fix a branching timeline? That's something that is going to get answered in the show, I'm sure of it. I'm interested as well whether or not the series is going to end with Loki going back to 2012 with the Tesseract, and he just becomes his old self again. He merges with his old self and he forgets all of these kind of fun TVA adventures. Or is he going to somehow branch off and be a sustainable timeline on his own? That's going to be quite interesting to see. The other big question I've got for Loki is, why are the TVA trying to keep this one sacred timeline? My theory relates to Doctor Strange again, because in Infinity War, we see Doctor Strange, doing his whole voodoo thing to see all the different potential futures that could happen. and there's only one where the Avengers succeed. So is the reason for the TVA trying to protect this one timeline because it's the only timeline where they defeated Thanos? Or it could be a selfish reason, because I think in the original comic books, the Timekeepers, who are the people that run the TVA, they're kind of the power behind it. So could it be more of a selfish reason where a horrible thing happened to the Timekeepers in a previous iteration of the universe, and they're trying to make sure that the timeline is going in a direction where that doesn't happen to them? I think from a Marvel point of view, the kind of dark twist of that seems likely, but I do like the idea that it's just a wholesome thing of, well, this is the universe where we stop Thanos. So that's my hope for Loki, that's going to clear up some of our confusion about time travel. You know, can you change time without the Infinity Stones? That's a big question that Endgame kind of left quite confusing. And this whole business between the Russo brothers having a different idea of what happened to the writers didn't help that. So hopefully Loki's going to answer all of that. I'm really excited for the show. It looks kind of like Marvel's version of Doctor Who, and I like Doctor Who, so I'm very excited. So I might do like a review or speculation video or something when Loki starts coming out, so subscribe and stay tuned for that. But I hope you enjoyed this very long, rambly video on time travel and how it's confusing in MCU.